Zach,
That's right.
welcome to the show.
Thank you, man. Nice to be here.
Yeah, it's good to have you on. We were talking a couple years ago with someone else from your agency
That's
about
right.
sea lampreys, and it was a topic that was really, really popular. People
bet.
were very interested in it, but
Sure.
some things have happened since then. So we thought it'd be great to have you on today and talk a little bit about this topic. First of all, let's just get into lampreys. There's different types of them. There's different kinds of them.
There are.
Some of them are native, and
That's
you
correct.
guys kind of look at those as like those are okay lampreys.
That's right.
Then we have some that are invasive. Can you get into that a little bit for us?
So sure. Well, there's 5 species of lampreys in the Great Lakes. One of which is the invasive sea lamprey. There's a chestnut and a silver lamprey. They're both parasitic, similar to a sea lamprey. They've co-evolved with the Great Lakes fish, so they usually don't kill their hosts. Unlike a sea lamprey, which is much larger when it's in its juvenile parasitic phase, and they usually kill their host fish that they latch onto. There's 2 other native lamprey species, the American brook lamprey, northern brook lamprey. They're not parasitic at all. They're usually just residents of the stream.
That's interesting. Do they go out in the lakes?
No, not really. Anyway, maybe around the mouth of a lake, incidentally, but they usually just hang out in river systems.
Okay.
They play a role in that ecosystem.
Do you want to tell us a little bit about sea lampreys and how they ended up into the Great Lakes?
Oh yeah, you bet. Sea lampreys are native to the Atlantic Ocean, and way back in the day, early 1800s, they built that Erie Canal system. That was their main avenue to gain access into Lake Ontario and the Finger Lakes, etc. But so they were in Lake Ontario since spotted in the early 1800s. Then in the early 1900s, they finished the Welland Canal system that connects Lake Ontario to Lake Erie. That was just a swimway for them to get up into the other Great Lakes. Bypassed that Niagara Falls that acted as a barrier forever until then.
So that's an interesting thing. So these things have been out in the ocean forever, and don't cause issues there.
Correct.
Tell me about why it's such an issue in the Great Lakes compared to ocean going through.
Right. So when they're in their native habitat, the fish that they're parasitizing on are much hardier, much bigger, and they've co-evolved to not die from a sea lamprey attack. They have no natural place in the Great Lakes. The fish are much smaller. Once they were in there, it was just, there's a lot of fish for them to feed on, and that was kind of acting as an ocean for them. So they can live their full lives in fresh water, as opposed to the ocean where they spawn in freshwater streams and then live in the salt water. So once in the Great Lakes, they, back in the day, they decimated fish populations almost to all gone, almost.
Right. Yeah. So we're kind of thinking about how things are now.
Right.
But these things were able to get into the Great Lakes, in the 1800s.
Yes.
Before there were ways to treat them. What were the fisheries like then, and what did sea lampreys do to fish at that point, like in the 1800s, before there were, people out there like you guys that were trying to get rid of them?
Right. Well, they first spotted them. There's reports of them in Lake Ontario in the early 1800s, but it didn't seem that there was a big issue, like they were impacting the fishery too much. Not much information on that. It's once they gained access to Lake Erie in 1921, then the subsequent lakes, 1936 was Lake Michigan, 37 Huron, which is weird because they weren't spotted. Lake Michigan's farther away, and then by 1948 in Lake Superior. And that's when the damage, that's when they started showing up. People started observing them, and commercial fisheries were catching these fish with lampreys attached to them. They didn't even know what they were.
Right.
And then from then, like a bunch of empty nets. It's like, oh, where are all the fish gone?
Yeah.
So they played a big role in decimating fish populations, especially lake trout, ciscos, and whitefish. It was like in it was a dire situation for sure.
Talk to me a little bit about the life cycle of the sea lamprey. How does it basically go from birth to death when it's out there?
Right. So I'll start with when they're spawning adult phase. So they run up a river in the spring similar to a trout. They'll go up and find suitable spawning habitat. So they want rocks. So they're a Petromyzon marinus. It kind of means stone sucker of the sea. So they make their horseshoe-shaped nests out of rocks. They'll suction onto rocks with their oral disc. It's like a suction cup. They'll build these nests, and then female will wiggle in there, and the male will attach himself to the top of the female, like latch on with the oral disc, and they'll shake around and they'll release sperm and eggs. And that's how they spawn. So, 2, 3 weeks later, little mini larvae, they're called amicetes, will hatch. And they'll drift down the river a bit, and in suitable habitat like detritus or muck, anything like that, they'll burrow right in there, stick their little heads out, and they'll filter feed microorganisms. They'll stay there for typically 3 to 5 years as larvae. They have no eyes, they have no teeth, they're totally benign. You'd never know they were there. And other fish in the area aren't targeting them because they're not part of their natural ecosystem. So if they're left unchecked, they will metamorphose. They'll develop eyes in this mouth, and their digestive system will change, and they'll head out and they'll start feeding on the Great Lakes native fish. And within 12 to 18 months, year and a half, they'll return as full spawning adults.
And do they die after they spawn?
They die after they spawn, you bet. Something that it's in some literature no one really talks about, but it's also not good having them there, even if they die, like the adults die, because they've been feeding on top predator fish. So they're full of like heavy metals and toxins, and their bodies will, degrade in the stream, and that does add some, a level of pollution in there as well. How significant it is, I don't know, but there's not much on that, but I always found that interesting too.
Yeah. How many eggs do they typically lay when they spawn?
100,000.
Wow.
A lot.
Dang. And what is the survival rate on something like that?
It all depends on conditions. Even if you said 1%, even if it's 1,000 that survive, and even if half of that, let's say from one spawning female, 500 larvae are allowed to transform and head out into the lakes, times that by 40 pounds of fish each, that's a lot. And that's just from a very low survival rate from one female.
So we talked about how these in the ocean, they're feeding on fish that have evolved with them.
Right.
They're larger fish, they're hardier fish that don't die. What do you believe, or what does the commission believe is, the total mortality from sea lampreys in the Great Lakes every year?
Every year right now, it's hard to say. So, for instance, in Lake Ontario, past few years, the numbers have gone quite up. In 2020, there's no travel, all the travel restrictions. So
yeah, talk about that a little bit about how that's happening.
Yeah, so there was no sea lamprey control, no lampricide treatments happening because you couldn't travel, and all those ready to spawn larvae, ready to transform and head out larvae, were allowed to head out into the lake untreated. So then through index surveys, creel surveys, and just endless anglers and fishers coming up and saying, "Oh, it's so bad this year, and we experienced that last year certainly at the show, and I'm still hearing it, like today and yesterday.
And it's something that I hear people talk about all the time. They're like, "Well, what would happen if we just stopped doing this?"
Right? Yeah.
We found out exactly what happens if we just stop doing this.
It's not, like I said, it's not a good thing that we couldn't treat, but it is kind of just a little sneak preview into what might happen, and that's just one season, on one lake. That Humber River, for example, that's an index stream. That trap had, in the spring of 2022, about 7,000 adults in it in the spring, like one trap, just loaded with them, and that's unheard of.
So when you guys are out doing what you do right now, because we went that year without it, because those lampreys are out there in larger numbers.
Yeah.
What are you guys seeing then with the returns of them coming in?
Not sure quite what you mean.
When they're coming in to spawn, the
Yeah.
numbers that you're seeing now,
Right.
compared to maybe what you saw 5 years ago.
Yeah, it depends. It depends where. Like I said, in Lake Ontario specifically, a lot more are returning to spawn. But that whole bunch that were allowed to parasitize and feed in return, that was a generation. So hopefully as controls have come back,
Right.
that whole line of them will die off and it'll restore the numbers. It just takes multiple years to catch up. So 1 year off, and then it's multiple years to kind of get those numbers to like acceptable levels. Each Great Lake has, it's like a target, we call it. It's an acceptable level of lampreys in the lake itself. And Lake Ontario is certainly above target, unfortunately, right now. Then you have Lake Erie, for example, that is doing quite well and it's below target.
Why do you think that is?
Well, there's not a huge amount of them in Lake Erie to begin with. I don't think it's their most suitable environment. They do go for the cold, deep, dark water species. That's where they hang out.
Yep.
They say their favorite food is, lake trout, whitefish, sturgeon, anything down there, walleye, burbot, all that stuff. Sure.
So when the sea lamprey attaches to, let's say, a king salmon,
Yes.
what happens? Can you go through like what it would take, how long it takes for them to kill that king salmon? But what happens once it hooks on? What's the timeline like?
Yeah, again, there's so many variables, right? It depends what happens with that fish. If that fish gets caught 10 minutes later after an attack, it'll likely drop off. And the person who catches it, who does it, they'll remove it. So it could be that, but often they'll stay on a fish until the supply of blood and body fluids that they're feeding from aren't a viable source of food for them anymore. So whether that's fatigue or sickness or they're starting to go, or they're running out of blood. They can suck quite a bit of blood. That's why they call them the vampires of the Great Lakes. And often, a big fish like that will can have multiple lampreys on it. And that'll certainly expedite its bitter end, unfortunately. But it does all depend. It can be in a day or a week. Well, it depends how long it takes, how warm the water is, how big the fish is, how healthy the fish is. Sure.
Can you tell me a little bit about, we talked about treatment.
Right.
How do you treat the rivers?
Yeah. So the main method of treatment is using an aquatic pesticide called Lampricide. The big winded is 3-trifluoromethyl 4-nitrophenol, which is a big winded. We call it TFM. It's kind of the main measure of control. So you have assessment crews go to all these tributaries where there are sea lamprey, like the residents of sea lampreys. People will do an assessment with backpack electroshockers. They'll find their distribution and they'll work their way up the stream, either where there's no suitable habitat and they're not there, or likely, a barrier gets in the way, they can't make it above that, whether it be a man-made or a natural barrier like some falls or something like that. So then they do a stream ranking, depending on how many there are and what age classes they assess that are in there. And they make a priority treatment plan. So crews will go around and apply Lampricide upstream of the distribution. They'll apply this chemical. It's yellow. And the treatment's happening. One can see it. It's like, it's like Mountain Dew flowing down. So it can look kind of alarming. It's in parts per million. That'll happen for about 12 hours, and often a stream will have, little mini tribs and trickles coming in. Those are potential escape routes for larvae. So we'll have little mini feeders, we call them, little mini pumps or TFM bars we also have to kind of keep them from going out. So they'll pop out of their burrows, they'll swim around. Oh, where's fresh water? Oh, here's some. Nope, wrong way. And then that's, their fate is sealed at that point for sure.
And I've heard that they release pheromones, so that's kind of like a pheromone to warn their buddies that something bad's going on. That could be a challenge when you're doing this.
For sure, yeah. Alarm cue is the thing. It's a chemical they release if there's dying or suffering lamprey, and they're working with that as a tool to potentially, either keep lampreys out of the stream or keep lampreys away from a certain side of a stream. So maybe they're more apt to swim up where there's not alarm cue into a trap, for example. And same with pheromones, like attractants. They'll use those to lure them onto a trap. They do all kinds of different methods. There's a whole program called supplemental control. It's called SubCon. They're trying different, alternate methods of treatment that aren't Lampricide or barriers. They include some barriers, but it's like electric weirs, sterile male release. They're playing with the pheromones and alarm cue kind of thing. It's interesting. It's coming up. There is a new Lampricide formulation being worked on right now as well, which could be really successful. Let's see.
We've got about a minute left. Is there anything that we didn't talk about today that you wanted to get to?
Yeah, I would. There's been that notion that it's kind of the old narrative that Lampricide is only selected to sea lampreys, and that's not true. Unfortunately, during Lampricide treatment, the native lampreys that are there will also succumb to its effects. There are some sensitive species that will also happen. It's one of those greater good scenarios. It's a shame, and no one wants chemical in their water. no one likes any non-target mortality, but it often is, even at a small level. It's a trade-off. And we have experts that read the concentration and keep that as low as possible, just enough to kill lampreys and nothing else. But understanding that non-target mortality is often a factor is important for people to continue to support the program. So we have that social license to operate. Essential.
Yeah.
Sure. People support is essential is the main thing. And anyone who wants to ask anything about that, hit us up.
Yeah. I got the website on the screen right now. It's glfc.org.
That's
the
correct.
Great Lakes Fishery Commission.
That's right. Or sealampreycontrol.org. They both go to the same spot.
All right.
Yeah.
Very good, man. We appreciate you coming on.
Awesome, for sure.
Thanks a lot for stepping on
My
and
pleasure,
having
man.
a chat with us.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much.